Just at the 2 o'clock mark, so we're going to get started. And welcome to everyone who's joined us today for this Jewish Gen Talk with Dr. Sally Ann Sack. My name is Avraham Grohl, and I serve as Executive Director of JewishGen.org. And for those of you who are regular attendees of our Jewish Gen Talk series, thank you for being part of it and for once again participating. We're glad that you're with us. And if you're new, we welcome you as well. Hope that you've been involved on Jewish Gen. If not, make sure you visit our homepage at JewishGen.org. There's a lot that you can learn and take advantage of. Make sure you sign up for our discussion group and our social media, the Jewish Genealogy portal on Facebook. And we hope that you will participate in future webinars as part of the Jewish Gen Talk series as well. As you can see on the chat, we have people on this webinar from throughout the world. So we really, really appreciate that you taking the time to be with us today. We are privileged to host Dr. Sally Ann Sack as our speaker, who will talk to us about what Jewish genealogists need to know about Jewish given names. Just by way of introduction, Dr. Sack needs no introduction in the Jewish genealogy world, but she is the founding chair of the International Institute for Jewish Genealogy. She is the past president of the International Association of Jewish Genealogical Societies, the umbrella organization for societies around the world. She is a recipient of that organization's Lifetime Achievement Award. She is an editor and co-owner of Avotenu, the International Review of Jewish Genealogy. She is the founder of Jewish Genealogy Society of Greater Washington. She has authored or co-authored 7 books. She has chaired or co-chaired 7 IAJGS conferences, and she continues to be involved in the Jewish genealogy world and is a constant source of advice and support for many, many different projects. So we feel very, very fortunate to have you here today, Dr. Sack. Before you get started, just a note, this session is being recorded, and we'll make the recording available on our YouTube channel. It's also going to be on our Facebook page, facebook.com/JewishGen.org. Please make sure you like our page. We'll post a message on our discussion group when the webinar is loaded to YouTube. And if you're not on the discussion group, you can visit our homepage and click on Connect. And without any further ado, I pass it over to Dr. Sack.
Thanks, Avrami. Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming to this talk. I'm going to start with something that speakers are never supposed to do, and that's with an apology. Unfortunately, by its very nature, this topic is full of details, and I'm not going to make it easy for you with lots of slides. Rather, this is going to be an exercise in listening. But please feel free to write as many questions as you like in the chat. Avrami will help at the end choose some, and I will stay here as long as you like to answer as many as possible. What I can't answer today, however, I promise to write to you afterwards to do my best if you will leave your question with an email attached to it. The other apology is that I have to read this lecture because I simply can't remember it all. I hope that won't be too dull. So let's get started. I spent many hours the summer of 1993 painstakingly editing the first Alexander Bader book that Avotenu ever published. It was slow work because his English wasn't nearly as good then as it has become now. Nevertheless, I'm everlastingly grateful for having to do so because it made me read carefully every word of his scholarly but incredibly detailed introduction to everything one could possibly want to know about how Jews got their family names in the Russian Empire. Afterwards, I thought about all the matronymic and patronymic names that Bader described, and I wrote him a letter saying that I wondered if he knew that there was another book hidden within his dictionary, that it was a book on Jewish given names. Needless to say, I was more than gratified when Sasha gave Avotenu his Jewish name, his Jewish given name book, the bibliographies in the chat, his given name book to publish. And for those who aren't quite sure, a matronymic name is a name that's derived from somebody's mother, And the patronymic names you probably recognize are the father's names. Many books on Jewish names are in circulation now, but without a doubt, the Sasha book stands above all the others in its scholarly depth and comprehensiveness. Bader is a very straightforward guy. On the really rare occasions when he's been wrong, he's the first to say so and correct it. On the other hand, he's also not shy about saying when he thinks other books are shoddy or incorrect or uninformed. For example, Benzion Kaganoff has written a great deal on the subject, but Bader points out that Kaganoff's conclusions are not reached scientifically. An example of Bader's rare excellence arose when it was time for him to defend his second PhD dissertation, this one on Jewish onomastics, which means names. That was at the Sorbonne, and the faculty was in a quandary because it couldn't find any other scholars qualified to test him. And it concluded that, quote, there is only one Sasha Bader. All of this is to say that to learn about the meaning and origin of a Jewish given name, start with the Bader book. Avotenu has published 3 articles by Bader that illustrate how he has used his knowledge of Jewish given names to illuminate Jewish history, specifically Jewish migration through Europe. And the references to those articles are also in the chat. When DNA testing became available for migration studies several years ago, it was no surprise to learn that the geneticist's findings completely paralleled what Bader had written. So, how do Jews get their names? Ashkenazi Jewish males traditionally had 2 names. One was their sacred name, their Shem HaKodesh, often called their Hebrew name. They received this at their Brit Milah, their bris, on the 8th day of life, and the format has always been the same. The baby's name, followed by Ben, which is Hebrew for son of, and then the father's Shem HaKodesh. Under Jewish law, the Shem HaKodesh is used when the boy is bar mitzvah at age 13, when he's called to the Torah, when he is married, and when he is buried. Boys also received a vernacular name, usually Yiddish. Sometimes they got 2 Yiddish names. The Yiddish name may have been a variant of the Hebrew name, or it may be something entirely different. The boy may also have acquired a secular name. So, for example, one of my great-grandfathers from Poland had the Hebrew name Tuvia. In Yiddish, he was known as Tevel, and in Polish, his name was Tobias. And I've got records for him in all 3 different names. The moil who officiated at the bris kept a register, a pinkas, of every circumcision he performed. This was extremely important because the date of the bris was used to date the boy's bar mitzvah. Jewish law did not require that records be kept of births. The date of circumcision, however, was kept because it was needed for Jewish ritual purposes. Naming a baby girl was much different. In fact, there were no rules at all. The format was the same, the given name followed by bat, which means daughter of, and then the father's Hebrew name. But one could choose any name desired, Hebrew, Yiddish, or secular. As a result, girls' names often were less traditional, though most were Yiddish. And since girls didn't have a bar mitzvah, no Jewish religious records were kept. And for this reason, many Ashkenazi women did not know their exact birth date. Instead, it was not uncommon to hear that a woman was born near Hanukkah or Erev Pesach. In other words, dating according to an event on the Jewish calendar. What names were chosen? Despite popular belief, Jewish law, the halakha, does not address the question of what names may be chosen. No laws control the selection of given names. What there was, however, and still is to a great extent, was a custom so strong among traditional, observant Ashkenazi Jews that most people think it is law. By the way, I keep saying Ashkenazi and you're wondering why. Much of what I'm saying covers the Sephardi as well. But since most of this audience today comes from Ashkenazi Jews, that's what we're focusing on. The custom was that a baby was named in memory of a close deceased relative. He was not given the name of someone who's still living. That's if you're Ashkenazi. And I want to tell you a little story about that. I gave a talk on this one several years ago out in Michigan. And when I got to this point, a woman stood up and said, I have to tell you a story. When my son was born, I really wanted to give him my father's name because I loved it so much. And I went to my father and said, would it be all right if I gave your grandson your name? And my father said, it's your baby. You can give the baby any name you want. But if you give him my name, then all my friends will know that you wish me dead. So you see, very strong custom. The choice of the specific deceased relative that you're naming after is not fixed. In some places, it seems as if the first children were named for the father's deceased relatives. In other places, the choice seemed to depend more on other factors, such as the gender of the baby. In my father's family, the first daughter was named in memory of her father's mother. In my mother's family, however, the first son was named in memory of the mother's father, even though both fathers were deceased, both the grandfathers were deceased at that time. Given how many children our ancestors had, it's not surprising that they would run out of close relatives to memorialize. When that happened, specifically among Hasidic Jews, babies often were given the names of revered rebbes. I've been told that there's hardly any Chabad Lubavitch family that does not have a son named Menachem Mendel, the name of the highly beloved deceased leader of that group. According to Dr. Jeffrey Malka and others, Sephardic Jews, on the other hand, name a baby in honor of close relatives, whether those relatives are living or dead, and they're named in a fixed order. The first son is given the name of the father's father. The second son is given the name of the mother's father. The first daughter gets the name of the father's mother, and a second daughter is given the name of the mother's mother. Subsequent children are given the names of aunts and uncles. Among the women, especially, pretty secular names, such as flowers or gems, are especially popular. And according to Bader, by the way, this is true of any group of Jews. He says Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Italian, or North African Jews, the women get pretty names, secular names. Biblical names were always far more common among the men than the women, probably for several reasons. For example, the fact that only men are given a Hebrew name as their bris, as well as an everyday vernacular name, or the fact that the number of female names in the Bible is really quite small. Now we come to something called amuletic names. Although it's not often discussed, we should remember that our ancestors tended to be pretty superstitious, especially when it came to the so-called angel of death, the Malach HaMovad, also known as the evil eye. Infant mortality was high, and various strategies were employed to ward him off. The color red also was supposed to scare off the Malach HaMovad, and my own mother in Cleveland, Ohio, in 1936, tied a red ribbon on my baby carriage for that very reason. And it was not only Jews who did this either. Non-Jews are still doing it in some places. When my husband and I visited the rural Western Ukraine region where my maternal grandmother was born, that was in 2012, our guide pointed out a red ribbon tied onto the mane of a horse that was pulling a cart. And he asked if we knew why it was there. He nearly lost control of the steering wheel when I said, sure, and explained, and he claimed that I was only the second person he had ever guided who knew the answer. He wasn't so happy that I knew it either. Names also were important as a means of foiling the angel of death. If a baby became seriously ill, he or she would be taken to the synagogue and renamed so that when the angel of death came looking for Tuvia, no one with that name would be found, and in his place might be Chaim. These second renames are called amuletic names. That is, they act as amulets or magic charms. Chaim, which means life, and its female variant Chaya, were favorite amuletic names. So also were the names Alter, the old man, and Alta, the old woman, as well as Zaidi, grandfather, and Bubba, grandmother. What this means is that if a genealogist comes across someone named Chaim or one of those other names, he should try to determine if that person had another earlier name. This practice was common among Ashkenazi Jews all the way up to the Holocaust, and not only in Europe. Here's an example. My mother called me one day after I'd been doing genealogy for several years, and she told me the following story. Her older brother, Dave, born in Toronto in 1911, was getting ready to retire and needed to submit his birth certificate, which he could not find. He sent away for a copy and was shocked to see his name recorded as Victor. Uncle Dave had no idea why, and he called his sister, who was the one in the family that seemed to remember everything. My mother said that I would know, and I did. A few years before that, I had taken a research trip to Toronto, Canada, where my mother's first cousin, Victor Stone, lived. Victor explained that he had been given the Hebrew name Avigdor in memory of his grandfather, Tuvia Steinschneider, and that Victor was his English name. My mother's maiden name was Steinschneider. The Toronto Steinschneiders had changed their name to Stone. Obviously, my Uncle Dave also was named in memory of Tuvia Steinschneider, which made sense since he was the second son, and the first son had been named for the paternal grandfather. I asked and learned that yes, my mother knew that her brother had been seriously ill as an infant. But how did Victor become David? Well, think about the name Tevel, which is the diminutive in the Yiddish for Tuvia. Then think about Davidel. The letters D and T are what linguists call dental consonants. That is, sounds made with the tip of the tongue against the teeth. As such, they easily substitute for one another. So it's not such a stretch that Tevel becomes Davidel, each with a letter V and the L. One caution, do not automatically assume that someone with the Hebrew name Chaim, or maybe Chaimi, had his name changed in babyhood. Chaim actually might have been named in memory of an earlier ancestor who had been the one with the changed name. Jewish genealogy is very complicated. Now we have diminutives and spelling. Always remember that Jewish genealogy deals with 3 different alphabets: Hebrew, Cyrillic, and Latin, with consequences for the transcription from one to another. In Yiddish, nicknames that started as diminutives but gradually lost their affectionate character typically were formed by the addition of suffixes containing the consonants K or L at the end of the name. Thus, bear became barrel or berka, and the Hungarian grandmother after whom I'm named was called Sarahana. But as I learned when I sought her arrival record, the transcription into Latin letters was something I hadn't anticipated. There she was, listed as S-U-R-E. Sure, Hannah? According to the local Yiddish pronunciation where she lives, Sura equals Sarah, and it's spelled S-U-R-E. The folks at the U.S. National Archives who looked for her ship manifests for me thought that her name was the English word sure, so they were sure that wasn't the name I was looking for. I only found her entry by using a trick that an old hand had taught me. I scanned the manifest columns for gender and age, looking for an F for female and the age 16 in the age column. And that's how I found her. And what happened after they emigrated, after they left the old country? Just as our immigrant ancestors changed their family names after they immigrated to the United States and elsewhere, so also with their given names. My mother and mother-in-law, both of whom were born in the U.S. to immigrant parents who had not yet acculturated fully, were given the traditional old country Yiddish name of Fega. But when they started school in the U.S., their teachers had other ideas. My mother's teacher renamed her Frances, a name she liked and carried the rest of her life. In my mother-in-law's case, the change was to Frida, a name she also liked and carried her whole life. My father, originally Moshe or Macy in Litvak Yiddish, became Max when he started school. But so did a cousin whose original name was Mikhail, the Russian form of Michael. You might think that Mikhail would easily become Michael. No, this teacher gave him the name Max. She thought that was appropriate for a little Jewish boy. Lots of other boys with names that started with M, such as Mendel, Mordecai, or Meyer, also ended up as Max in the United States. And of course, our ancestors themselves played around with their names. One of my ancestors arrived as Moshe, became Mo, then Morris, which was the most common fashionable American equivalent for Moses, and then as Maurice, as in Maurice Chevalier when he became rich. His tombstone says Moses. Or take the name Harry. When my younger daughter was still in medical school, she asked me if I could look up a ship arrival record for a friend of hers, whose grandfather was Harry Solomon from Romania. I happily took myself downtown to the National Archives and started to scroll the microfilm reels. I found lots of Harry Solomons, but surprisingly, they all seemed to be English sheep farmers. After I paused to think about this a little bit, I realized that no Jew had arrived in the United States with the name Harry. And instead, I started to look for Tzvi or Hirsch, and I found him very quickly. And by the way, that friend who I assumed was a girlfriend has been my son-in-law now for the past 30 years. Yet not all Harrys were originally Tzvi or Hirsch. Some were Chaim, and my Uncle Harry was Arki, a nickname for Aaron. What all this tells us is that no one-to-one equivalences ever existed between English and Hebrew or Yiddish names. So don't say, what's the English name for Moses or something like that. Uncle Eddie, whose Shem HaKodesh was Isaac, first was called in the United States Isidore or Izzy. Later, when he decided he didn't like the connotations that came to be associated with that name, he adopted Edward or Eddie. Other Isidores became Irving. Isidore originally was a popular German name, but when Jews began to use it as a fashionable name for Israel or Isaac, it came to be considered a Jewish name, and the Germans stopped using it. Websites that purport to show Hebrew and Yiddish equivalences do exist, but they shouldn't be taken as gospel. The Hebrew name Solomon is not only Shlomi, but also Zalman in Yiddish, and Zalka as a diminutive. And in one case in my family, a tombstone showed Zalkan, a variant that even Bader had never seen. Sometimes baby boys were given the Yiddish equivalent of their Hebrew names, like Tevye, but not always. And though there were no official equivalences of Yiddish names, sometimes it could seem as if there were. I remember a president of my local genealogy society in Washington, very assimilated Jew, who was skeptical when we insisted that his grandmother, Rosalie Blau from New York, certainly was the same person as the person listed in a Hungarian document as Rochalea Blau. He didn't see how Rochalea became Rosalie. Now I'm coming almost to the end. This is entitled How I Solved the Amder Problem. Amder is my maiden name. My father was only 8 years old when his father died in the 1918 flu epidemic, the one they keep talking about. As a result, he could tell me little about his father's life. We also didn't know any of my grandfather's didn't know any of that grandfather's relatives when I was growing up. There weren't any around. The immigrant relatives all were on my paternal grandmother's side of my father's family. When I began my genealogy research, I had no direct Amder relatives to interview. All I had were scraps of information. And here's what I gleaned from interviewing my father and his siblings. Avrami, would you put up the first slide, please? If you're still there. Avrami. If he doesn't come back, we aren't going to get the slide.
Yes, I'm doing it.
Okay.
It. Second. Hold on.
Oh.
Okay. Can you see the screen?
I did. What I did when I started out was I got my father and his living brother and sister together, along with my oldest cousin, whose mother had died, and got them to talk. And from that, I got my father born in 1910, and his oldest brother, Simon, was born in 1900. There were children in between. My dad was the fifth. And their father's name was Gedalia Wolf Amder. He'd been born in 1869, died in 1918, married to Rachelea Shulkin. My father, who had an amazing memory for childhood, reported that he had an uncle Peretz, but we didn't know if he was an Amder or a Shulkin. And then I learned from Uncle Simon that he didn't tell me. Later I learned his real name was, whatever real name meant, was Zalka. And I also learned from talking to them, that Gedalia Wolf had a younger brother named Shimon Yaakov, who lived in London, and who had a son named Solly. Okay, so that I had these scraps. Now I'm going to explain how knowledge of Jewish given names enabled me to extend that knowledge to about 1730 without a missing link on my family tree.
Dr.
This bit of research.
Do you still want
can take it down now. This bit of research remains my biggest and most rewarding genealogical success. Early on in my genealogy quest, in the 15 years or so before communism collapsed and the Tsarist archives in the former Soviet Union opened up, back in those days when we had no access, my strategy was to collect every scrap of data I could find on any Amder anywhere in the world. And in those pre-computer days, I created a card file for everyone I found, a card in the card file. When the archives opened in the early 1990s, I wrote to all the relevant archives I could find, and even to the little historical museum in Wrocław, the teeny town where my grandfather was born. I acquired a Polish Jewish census of 1768 from the Lithuanian archives in Vilnius. But my biggest haul came from hiring Avotenu contributing editor for Latvia, Alexander Fegmanas, who found Amder records in Latvia, Lithuania, and Belarus. Among other data, Fegmanas sent me copies of Russian revision lists from the first half of the 19th century and family lists after mid-1800s. These listed the father, mother, minor children, and any other relatives living in the household. But we know that they frequently were not complete, that the boys might not be listed. Eventually, through JewishGen, I met a distant Amder cousin, a high school computer teacher named Mike Ross, who lived in Perth, Australia. Mike offered to computerize all my file cards and put them online, which he did. Our Amder website predated AncestryGenie.com and MyHeritage. And thanks to everything I had collected, we built a huge main trunk of the Amder family. To our chagrin, however, even after that, we still didn't know exactly how we were related to one another, nor where our branches fit onto that main tree. One of my very knowledgeable genealogy friends, Harold Rode, whom some of you know certainly, assured me that I had accumulated so much data, he was sure my problem was that I was not correctly interpreting what I had. Remember, it's not just getting records, it's understanding what we have. Repeatedly and obsessively, I laid out on my long living room floor by date everything I had, and I stared at it. And my eyes kept returning to two items, two family lists, one from 1849 and one from 1859. Avrami, can you put up that slide, please? Hello, Avrami. Okay, now the next one. The next one, please. Okay, so here I lay out on the family floor. I've got a family list from 1849, and it has Isaac Simon, the father, and there's an unnamed daughter, and Peretz and Judah. And then there's a family list from the same little town with Isaac Simon, a daughter, and Peretz, and a Zalman. So now I'm staring, and I'm saying, are Judah and Zalman two different people, or the same one with two different names? Their ages were listed, their ages weren't quite right for 10 years apart, but we knew that ages don't matter very much. They weren't very accurate. And I see that the name Peretz is associated with the Amders and not the Shulkins. Okay. By the way, the name Simon, actually my researcher had written Shimon, but Litvaks pronounce the S sound, they drop the SH sound. So Shabbos is Sabbas, and Moshi is Macy. So the fact that it was Simon or Shimon didn't matter. And I also, as I said, had the name Peretz. By that time, I had an enormous number of Amder names and lots of revision lists. But these two were the only ones in the whole bunch that had the name Simon and or Peretz, and they were in the same family. I should add that among my bits of accumulated data was a letter from a Jewish Amder who lived in Braslav in the early 1990s. He also had a Shimon, a Simon, and a Peretz in his family. So at this point, I knew that Peretz had been my father's uncle on the Amder side and not on his mother's Shulkin side, as initially I'd assumed. I also knew from Bader and also from Harold Rode, who's so experienced, that Peretz was not a common name among Litvak Jews. So it seemed obvious that this must be my family. But if my uncle Simon was named after his grandfather, as he supposedly was, then the generations were wrong. And who was Judah and who was Zalman? Were they the same person? I was really not sure where I was going. The only document I had from my Amder grandfather was his declaration to become a citizen. The next slide, please. He had taken that out not long before he died. And in it, he wrote his name as Yiddel Wolf Amder, Jdel. I was really puzzled the first time I saw that, and I remained so for years. As we shall see in a few minutes, my error was in pronouncing it to myself as if the J were the same as the letter Y. In fact, in that part of the world, in Poland and in Russia, the Roman letter J often was interchangeable with the letter I. So, for example, we find documents in which the name Jacob is written I-A-C-O-B, and there are other examples. And this reminds us to always, always learn how letters are pronounced in the areas where they are used. So the first time I saw Jdel, I pronounced it to myself as Yiddel, and I wondered what it was doing there. Since I knew the word Yid as a derogatory way to say a Jew, and the letter L at the end of Yiddish words as a diminutive, I assumed that it meant little Yid or little Jew, but I had no idea why that would be on this paper. So I did what I do when I can't solve a problem. I pushed it aside, and it remained buried until my father-in-law died in the late 1990s in Worcester, Massachusetts. Can we have the next slide, please? At the funeral director mentioned that the deceased's father, my father-in-law, whom we always knew as Idle, my first husband's grandfather was Idle, that Idle had been one of the men who had started the Jewish cemetery in Worcester, Massachusetts. And the funeral director showed us the file card, pre-computers, he had for Idle, where the name was listed as Yehuda. Oh, I said to myself, Idle is Yehuda. Still, the penny didn't drop right away. I guess the information needed to percolate some more in my brain. Until one afternoon, you can take that down now if you want, Rami. One afternoon, not long after that moment in Worcester, when I was lying down and again musing about what I thought of as my AMDR problem. I was doing that. And actually, what I was really doing was the classic psychoanalytic activity known as free association. I'm a Freudian analyst. Idle is Yehuda, I said to myself. Yuda also is Yehuda. And I guess that Idle, I was still pronouncing it, or Yiddle, I was still pronouncing it incorrectly, is Idle. So Yiddle is Yehuda. Suddenly I wondered if my grandfather's father was named Yehuda, and if my grandfather had written his father's name on his own declaration of intent to become a citizen. Let's look back at that declaration of intent again, Avrami, the previous one, the one before that, please. The declaration of, yeah, there it is. Look at that. I was familiar with the Russian custom of listing a man's patronymic in the place where we typically put our middle names. So the name Boris Ivanovich means Boris, son of Ivan. But was it possible that my grandfather had reversed the order and written his patronymic first? Could he have been indicating that the father of Wolf Amder was named Yehuda, or Idle for short? Again, I consulted Harold, my expert on Litvak Jewry, who has examined hundreds and hundreds of records from that area. Of course, Harold assured me, I've seen lots of records in that format. Naturally, I wanted Harold to be correct, but could I find anything to substantiate him? I knew my father's eldest brother to be my Uncle Simon, and he supposedly was named, according to family lore, in memory of Gedalia Wolf's father. In other words, Uncle Simon was named in memory of his grandfather. I also knew that Gedalia Wolf had a younger brother, who had settled in London, and that man's first name was Simon Yaakov. Gedalia Wolf obviously had given his firstborn the same name as his younger brother. That would have meant that Gedalia Wolf's father had died after Gedalia Wolf, but before the younger brother, Simon Yaakov, was born. But wait a minute, that couldn't be right. One of the other facts my father had told me was that Gedalia Wolf's mother had died young, leaving the two brothers, Gedalia Wolf and Simon Yaakov, and that his father had remarried and fathered a half-sister who was called Tilly in the United States. And just this year, I finally found her descendants. That meant that Simon Yaakov was not named in memory of his father. The father was alive when Simon Yaakov was born. He had remarried and had fathered a daughter. So I looked again at the slide, it's slide 7, I think. Want to look at Avrami? Show me the one with the tombstone, please. There we go. Where it says in Hebrew, here lies Simon Yaakov, son of Zalkan. Okay. Zalkan, follow this if you can. Eventually, I'm going to publish it in Avotena. You could read it there. Zalkan is a variant of Zalman. And my Uncle Simon had told my cousin Bill, they shared the same law office, that his real name, whatever that meant, was Zalka. Zalka is a diminutive form of Zalman. So Uncle Si is saying that he's named after a Zalman. He's named after a Simon. He's named after a Zalman. So then, in whose memory was Simon Yaakov named? Could it have been his grandfather, the man we saw earlier as Isaac, as Simon Isaac? Of course. And my Uncle Simon was named then in memory of both his grandfather, who was Yehuda Zalman, and his great-grandfather, Isaac Simon. Looked at it the correct way, it all fits. And now may I have the slide 6, please? Okay. Idel, Yiddle, or however I was pronouncing, is a variant of Idel. These two are diminutives of Yehuda. Yuda means Yehuda. Zalman is also Zalka, could be with an E. Yuda, son of Isaac Simon. Zalman, son of Isaac Simon. Zalman and Yuda are the same person. So therefore, my great-grandfather was, I would say it's Yehuda Zalman, because I'll put the Hebrew first. So what are the takeaways from all this? Teach yourself the pronunciation for the time and place of the records relevant to your search. And teach yourself to recognize all the variant spellings and diminutives that you can of Jewish given names. That might mean that you have to spend all your summer vacation reading the introduction to this Bader book, which I've done also. All right, that's it. Shall we have some questions now?
Okay, thank you very much. That was really very interesting. A lot of questions. A lot of questions have been very specific. So thank you for writing them in. We're not going to be able to get to those.
Rami, talk a little louder. I'll have to put on my headphones.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
All right. Right. There's a lot of questions that are very specific. So I'm looking for ones that are a bit more general in nature. Okay. Is there any guidance about, hold on a second. They're coming in so fast. I have to type it for a second.
While you're looking, I'm going to tell you one more thing I meant to ask that I only learned 2 days ago. Somebody wrote to me and said, did Jews ever name a subsequent child after an earlier one that had died in childhood? And I said, they didn't do that in my family because they thought it was bad luck. But he showed me the 2 records. I said, maybe they were both named after the same grandfather. Maybe they really wanted to memorialize that grandfather. And again, I went to Harold Road and he said, oh yeah, I've got a bunch of those in my family too. So though I was always taught that Jews didn't do that, this is another example of there really are no rules. There's always exceptions. All right, so do you have one? And there's one from is it possible that a child who died?
Are you reading that one?
No, I can't see it. You're going to read it to me.
Okay. All right. So there's is there guidance about changes if there's no information about an ancestor in ancestral communities? How would somebody trace what their ancestor's name might have been? So if in the US the name was Louis Jacobs, how would somebody go about trying to determine what the grandparents' name might have been?
Well, most of the Lewises I know in the United States were Leib. There may have been Laser or something else because we don't really know. So I guess the best answer is try to find some other source of information about that family, because it's a slender read to try to base it on a guess about a name. Start looking at cousins and others and see what you can learn.
Here's a general question. how common was it for people to change their given names, evading drafts, take the names of siblings? Are there any statistics on that?
That's a last name question, which you might remember I talked about in that talk on family names. But if we want to do a family name, in the latter part of the 19th century in Tsarist Russia, an only son in a family was exempt from the draft. So what did a family do that had more than one son? They gave them, for registration purposes, to family members who didn't have any sons. And those sons then carried a different last family name. So for example, Eli Evans, who used to be head of the Revson Foundation, he's an author. He's one, his grandfather was one of three brothers that were given away. Evans was the one the parents kept, and the others became Klein and I think Levine. And when all three brothers came to the United States, they didn't all take back the name Evans. They kept those other names. And so their descendants have different names, but they all trace back to an Evans family. So that's where you get this different name, if it's Russia.
Right.
If it was like the Napoleonic lands where Napoleon imposed, was the one who had the names taken, those Jews could choose any names they wanted. And lots of times brothers chose different last names.
But did it happen that they would just switch the names of siblings?
I can't hear you. I'm sorry, Abrami.
Did it happen that the siblings would switch names, the first names?
It's sometimes we have found in registration records that probably through bribery, Jews did all kinds of things to avoid being counted, because it wasn't any good thing when they wanted to count you. And that's what registration was all about. So they found ways not to be registered. I'm going to put on headphones so I can hear you better. Hang on a second. And sometimes two children were registered as one. I think you had to bribe people to do that. Or sometimes they were registered as girls. All right. Now let's see if this is better.
Can you hear me now? Okay, but we can't hear you now. Still can't hear you. No, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Okay, good. Okay, just gonna have to shout.
Okay. Okay, here's a question. Hold on, let me just. Okay, can you hear me?
Sure.
Okay, so the given name is Alter Mayer on a tombstone. It's Alter Mayer, the son of so and so. The question is, how would somebody know if a name might have been added at a later time, not what the person was given at birth, but at some point in that person's life, if they added a given name? Is there a way of knowing how that
happened? It sounds like what I was talking about with when the baby was ill, because Alter is such a commonly amuletic name, but there are other possibilities. I'm assuming this tombstone's in the United States. It might make a difference if it was in the United States or if it was in Russia. I think, again, it's a clue. You go back and you try to find other documents. You try to find people to ask, because you can't be sure.
Right.
I mean, that person may have been named after a relative whose name had been changed to Alter. And there he was given the name Alter. Like with Chaim, he might have been named after someone whose name had been changed a generation earlier and not be the one whose name was changed.
So a similar question that I think requires people to do research. Somebody wrote that their great uncle came to the United States as a child and his name was listed as Abraham, but as an adult, documents were Joseph. So the question is, what could be the reason for that? But I think the answer is that you have to research it.
But also you have to remember that Jews had at least two names, Jewish men, and all of us have seen documents where it's in you saw it with the family document I had, In one case, he was Judah. In one case, he was Zalman. But it was the same man. His name was obvious. Sometimes you get lucky and you get a document that has both names on it. But apparently there was no consistency in Russia. It could be listed as with the Hebrew name, or it could be listed with the Yiddish name. And in Poland, even my great grandfather was listed with the Polish name. So you just keep searching and remembering that he might have had the name Avraham Yosef. Or he might have just liked the name Joseph, like my Uncle Eddie, who didn't want to be Izzy.
Right. There are a lot of questions that are personal in nature. So I'm just going to ask everybody, if there are any questions that are general in nature, please post them. And this is not the forum to ask about surnames and last names.
I would put, if I may make a plug,
yeah.
The issue of Avotenu, the most recent one, winter 2020, the lead article is what every Jewish genealogist needs to know about family names. That's the talk I gave for Jewish Gen last summer, and it's in print, and you can read that if you want.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I think we'll wrap up some of these questions. I just want to mention a few things. First of all, you have a brief bibliography that you've asked me to post, which I'm going to do now in the chat. This is from Dr. Sack, our speaker. I just put that in the chat. And we'll also send out as a follow-up email, because there are a lot of messages coming in and there are a lot of people on this webinar. We're going to send out a follow-up email with this list of sources. I also want to mention that a great resource to look up names, given names, is the JewishGen Given Names database. I just posted a link to that in the chat, and you can find, we'll also put that in the email as well.
Rami, do you want to say something about how that database was compiled?
Well, it's linking the it links the European names and the foreign country, or whatever country people went to, what names they would adopt, and so you could type in Moses or Moshe, and you'll come up with Moses or Mosey, depending on where.
Okay, so these are names that we have found, you're saying, in various places.
Yes, and if I remember correctly, there are also specific databases for Galiciana names and so forth. There's a lot of information when you go on that website, which was.
Oh, there is one thing I do want to mention, but it's the last name. Of course, Jews changed their names when they got to Israel, just as they did to the United States. So you will find, people who've taken Hebrew, Israeli names that weren't their old country names. And that's another variation. They did that with last names. The last names databases, last name were changed officially, and that database of those official changes can be accessed on IGRA.
Okay, so I'm going to. I think we should wrap.
If I might.
Yes.
What I had told Rami at the beginning was that I anticipated that people were going to say, "What does the name XYZ? What does the name Zelek mean? What does the name such and such mean?" And that's what we call a question that really applies just to you. And the answer would be that I would go to the Beta book and look it up. But there's a big long paragraph for every name. And then there's an explanation of what it's derived from and where it's found and what all the variants are. And so I can't really type all that information in an answer. So much as I hate to say it, you have to wait until the libraries are open again and you can get a hold of a Beta book, or you can buy one. It's a really good book to have. Okay.
And you can buy one by visiting your website, avotenu.com. I'll
Right.
post that link in the chat, and we'll also send it out in the email, the follow-up email as well. And while you're there, you can also sign up for your journal, for the Albertina journal that
Yeah.
comes out every quarterly. All right, I think, okay, can you just clarify, there's a bunch of questions, the Dr. Bader books. You want to just give a summary of what that is?
Okay. Bader has written a book. Okay, the first book we ever published, Albertina ever published, was called A Dictionary of Jewish Surnames from the Russian Empire. Since then, he has written a whole slew of other books, A Dictionary of Jewish Surnames from Poland, A Dictionary of Jewish Surnames from Galicia, North Africa. He's now working his way around the Jewish world. But he also wrote a dictionary of Ashkenazi given names, which is what I've been talking about today, which I realized when I read his last name book that so many of the last names were taken from given names. And that was the book, that's the story that I consider really the only reliable scientific scholarly book on Jewish given names. There's lots of other books around, and people have all sorts of ideas about why, but the guy's got 2 PhDs, one from Moscow University in applied mathematics, and one from the Sorbonne in Jewish onomastics. He's really a genius. And this is, if you really want to know about Jewish names, this is what you read. Okay. Can I show the cover of the book again? Sure.
Yeah, maybe show that again.
Can you read? But the citation is in the chat.
Yes.
The listing.
It's a great book. It's a good opportunity for people to visit the Albertina website and purchase it. You'll find a lot of usefulness out of it.
Okay.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap this up. Thank you very, very much, Dr. Sack, and thank you to everyone who joined us. There have been hundreds and hundreds of people from around the world who have been on this. If we didn't get to your question, I apologize. There were a lot of things that came in, and if there was
It will
a general
take me some time because we're putting out the spring issue right now, and there's some other thing. But eventually, I will work my way down that whole chat list and write to all of you if the email's there. If Rami gives me the list of questions.
Yes, I'll share it with you and anybody who left their contact information. Thank you very much for reaching out to them. I just want to mention that this session is recorded, has been recorded, so you can all watch it again if you missed anything. And again, we'll post a message on the discussion group when the recording is live. And just encourage you to join the discussion group, visit our homepage and click connect. We've got a number of Jewish Gen talks coming up. Next week, we have Serena Rafe talking about Sephardic roots. Then actually we have a talk from Dr. Bader on Portuguese Jewry that will take place 2 weeks from now. And we have a number of other programs coming up as well. I posted in the chat the link to next week's presentation if you want to register already. And thank you again, Dr. Sack. This is your second Jewish Gen talk with us, which has been also very well received, and we appreciate your time.
It's my pleasure. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Okay. Take care, everyone.